Welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, the only podcast about all things waterfowl. From hunting insights to science-based discussions about ducks, geese, and issues affecting waterfowl and wetlands conservation in North America, we bring the resource to you. The DU Podcast with your host, Dr. Mike Brazier.
Today we have a very special episode because joining us in studio is Dr. Tom Moorman, Ducks Unlimited's former and recently retired chief scientist. Tom, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Mike. Glad to be back.
It's great to have you back. And joining us on the phone is none other than our man from up in Canada, Dr. Scott Stevens with Ducks Unlimited Canada. Scott, I'm not going to even go back into your title again because people should know by now who you are. We're just going to call you Scott from Canada. Will that work?
That works for me.
This is a pretty neat episode for a number of reasons. Number one, we do have Dr. Tom Moorman here with us in the studio. The first time you have been back to headquarters since, December of last year? Maybe even before that.
Yeah, December 31st of, 2020? Is that right?
Yeah. It's tough to keep the calendar
You had
straight.
plenty of unfinished business anyway, Tom.
Yeah,
so it's
I did.
Good you're back.
Yeah. Well, Brazier hadn't finished it all. I'm a little surprised about that. But
Well,
I'm here to
he
straighten
obviously
all that
doesn't know
out.
me very well, so
I'm going to straighten all that out while I'm here.
first thing we have to do is have a conversation with y'all, and it's here in mid-October. Scott, we spoke with you in September, sort of for our regular monthly update. It seems like we do that just about every month that we're doing this podcast. But this time of year is when we like to look north to get some reports on migration status, habitat conditions. We've talked about kind of the importance of looking at prairie wetland conditions now to help us figure out or get a sense of what it might take to produce good wetland conditions come next spring. And Tom, you are going to be also exceptionally valuable. Oh, you're always valuable to these conversations. You're going to be exceptionally valuable this time because you just returned from Canada yourself, right?
I did.
And so you were in Saskatchewan.
Yep,
right?
Western Saskatchewan.
And then, Scott, you have been traipsing all over the countryside up there based on your social media post, right?
That's right. I've been across Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta.
You probably wouldn't consider it traipsing, but that's the word I chose there.
Yeah, well, traipsing across some parts of it, so.
And so most of, or I guess all of those travels on both of your parts were related to hunting. And so I guess, what we're going to do here is get some reports on your hunting success, what you saw in terms of bird abundances, wetland conditions. I think the operative word there is still going to be dry, but we're going to hear from y'all firsthand. So, Tom, I just want to get into this right off with you, give you first crack at that because Scott is sort of old hand on this. We'll just get more of the same from him. So let's see what kind of assessment you can provide for us there.
Sure, Mike. So basically, we drove, and the reason I drive is because I like to bring dogs, and so we brought a couple of dogs and drove for 2 days up to Saskatchewan. So I had a really good look at the Dakotas and lots of western Saskatchewan. What you find is eastern South Dakota's pretty good shape, pretty wet, lots of birds. Unfortunately, that was not where we were hunting. As you get into North Dakota, a little bit of water in extreme southeast, but then it rapidly becomes pretty dry. And, of course, we diagonally crossed kind of just south of the Coteau, which is not really duck country, but you get a sense of how dry it is. There's still some wetlands that are mostly dry that you can see from the road. Crossed the border at Plentywood, Montana, and where we ended up going every year is near Lucky Lake, Saskatchewan. Luck Lake is a large alkaline lake. It's a big roost for cranes, geese, and sometimes ducks. That country is as dry as I have ever seen it. And so, what will that mean for duck production this past year? It probably means that part of the world didn't grow much. When I say dry, in the late 80s, I was a graduate student. That was the last significant extended drought, lasted about 3 years. Those folks who listened that hunted then will recall we were in a 3-30 situation. Pretty tough sledding, and when I got there, I knew it was dry. As we got sort of scouting around and looking, what I saw was, wow, it really, really is dry. A lot of semi-permanent wetlands are, if they're not dry, they're really close. They may dry up before freeze up. It was hot. It was in the mid-70s and windy, which is a recipe for sucking water out of wetlands. Most of the wetlands, one of the things in that part of the world that you can tell when it's dry is ranchers were hauling water, meaning stock ponds and surface water wasn't available for cattle in a significant kind of way. And the other thing you see in a situation like that is ranchers are haying everything they can because forage production is really low. Lots of the temporary and seasonal wetlands have been hayed. And if you know anything about tractors, they're a heavy piece of equipment. And if you know anything about wetlands, you don't usually drive through them. They are that dry. And so I think it's probably not as dry as it was in the late 80s, but it's close. And it could get there, walking the fields, upland hunting, chasing some huns and some grouse. The dirt's like powder. And, imagine yourself trying to put water in baby powder, that kind of a mix. So it's going to take pretty significant fall moisture. I hope we get it for a lot of reasons, for the ducks, especially for a frost seal, but also for those producers and cattlemen up there. They desperately need it.
So Scott, you traveled and hunted in a few different places from what Tom did. So kind of give us your windshield and field-based assessment along the same lines of what Tom did.
Yeah, very similar reports. I started in Manitoba. I think last time we talked about I relocated from where I was teal hunting to a different spot because things had just gone dry. So in Manitoba, there are a few isolated areas that have a little bit better conditions. We have an area in southwest Manitoba that last summer they got a bunch of rain, like 7 or 8 inches of rain in a 24-hour period, had flooding and those kind of challenges. That isolated area still has okay water, but yeah, everywhere else it's dry, like Tom described, seasonal and even semi-permanent wetlands going dry, the kind that you typically think of ringed by cattails. Many of those are dry. As I traveled to Saskatchewan, I spent the first part of that trip I drove through eastern Saskatchewan and kind of stopped to chase cranes east of Saskatoon. It was very dry in there. Like that stretch is probably the driest I've ever seen it in my career. Where we hunted cranes, there were cranes staging on some of those more permanent wetlands that had a little bit of water left in them, but there were not ducks in that country. There were not anywhere did I see a spot with enough ducks that I would think about setting up and hunting those. So it was that dry, kind of eastern Saskatchewan. I too trekked west and we were chasing white fronts, and that country was dry. We were in another little isolated spot that had maintained some of the water in those semi-permanent wetlands, and there were ducks around. So, when I think about sort of expanse, it's like there was probably a bit of duck production there, but pretty isolated spots. And then I know in Alberta too, we had, when we started the spring, there were parts of Alberta that had some water. That was sort of the bright spot across the prairies to start with. And so there's those areas probably produced a few birds, but yeah, writ large, it is very dry and probably the driest I've seen it, that widespread in my career also.
Scott, did you get up to the Peace River Valley? Do I remember that correctly? And were wetland conditions any different there?
Yeah, so that was the first time I had been up to that Peace River country. So just for the listeners, Peace River is kind of an isolated little river valley that has agriculture, and we usually lump it in with the larger prairies. It's a little further north. You go through a little boreal forest to get to it, so it's kind of this little isolated subunit, we would call it, of the Prairie Pothole region. Up there, I didn't see shallow water. We were hunting birds on larger staging lakes. And those are pretty stable and provide that kind of staging habitat pretty consistently. But I did not, same thing there. I did not see shallow water, seasonal, even semi-permanent water scattered across the landscape. So it was dry there too. Birds were staged on bigger water, but I would not have expected production to have been very good in that country either.
Tom, you mentioned that some of the seasonal and temporary wetlands had been hayed, so that tells me that those things had dried out to the point where they started producing growing vegetation. And we talked about that as sort of one of the natural steps of what occurs during drought and why it is good sort of long-term for the productivity of these of these wetlands. So, what about vegetation conditions around the rim of some of those semi-permanent wetlands? Mike Anderson talked with us about this a bit here in Minnedosa, or in Minnedosa. The water was pulled back, was down away from a lot of that cattail rim. Were you seeing good cattail response in some of those mud flats, or did you happen to take notice of that?
I did notice it, and the short answer is not really. They looked kind of dry, and I think it's a pretty interesting time because the water was so high that, well, let's start back. It was actually so low late 80s, in a lot of aspen growth around the edges. Then it flooded, and so there's lots of dead trees. And then you get down to the actual wetland margins, there's cattail. And no, I didn't see a great response, but it's also kind of late fall, so things are starting to sort of dry up, and winter's coming kind of deal. But yeah, I think most of the wetlands we hunted for the past several years were really kind of soft bottomed and tough sledding. Needed a good dog kind of wetland. Those are all dry, so they're going to firm up. A lot of that organic stuff's going to oxidize, and when the water returns, we'll of course be in that situation where the ducks will really, really be able to respond. So while it's tough sledding this year, and populations are probably not going to be great in terms of young birds anyway, this is one of those cyclical things that many young hunters have never experienced. But it's going to be okay, right? The water will return. Let's just hope it's not a extended drought in terms of years, right?
Yeah. Scott, I have a question for you here related to sort of the progression of the crop harvest, agricultural harvest up there. A lot of times that's something that we talk about when we're discussing, I guess, hunting success and the different tactics that people have to take during a given year. The timing of the harvest of some of those fields determines where the birds go and where you're going to be chasing them. What did we see in terms of that? How is the drought affecting crops and the progression of the harvest this year?
Yeah, in general, I would say the harvest was earlier because things were dry, and many of those crops had not done very well and kind of matured early and not produced a ton of seed and that kind of thing. So most of the harvest, even when I was in Saskatchewan in mid-September, most of it was done. Interestingly enough, there was a lot of canola that was still flowering this time of the year, which is strange. But I guess in some areas they got a little bit of rain that kind of spurred that on where it had not been doing much. So, I know looking at those areas, they had harvested some canola, and then they had some that was still blooming. It will probably not mature and produce any more crop, but a good example of strange conditions yielding strange results for producers too.
Yeah, so low yields on the duck front and low yields on the crop front as well. So drought is tough. Drought is tough all around. Let's transition now to talk about some of what you saw in terms of bird response. This is something that I've been curious about. We've seen, it feels like we heard early reports of abundant teal on the coast of Texas and Louisiana, almost shockingly high numbers, at least based on the reports that we heard, and that seemed odd. We knew, or we suspected, and I think the numbers will ultimately bear it out, that was not a result of a lot of production, and kind of got some of us thinking, is this an accelerated migration? Did they kind of terminate breeding? Did we see ducks either forego breeding altogether because of the dry conditions that they encountered, or did they maybe give it one or two attempts and then they just shut it down and said, hey, we're not getting any relief? Tom, what do you think based on what you saw there, based on what you saw down south, what you've heard from a lot of your contacts, and then what you saw when you got to Canada?
Yeah, Mike, I think this year, and of course I wasn't up there in spring, so you got to factor that in. But based on what I saw, I do think that blue wings bolted early. And I would describe, sometimes folks on the East Coast and West Coast call the middle of the country flyover country. The prairies right now for ducks in many ways, and probably this spring, were flyover country. They're that kind of dry. I think that blue wing abundance on the coast was a function of very, very dry conditions, actually all the way up. It's dry, kind of the western half of the continent's dry, right? And that's the Central Flyway and the Western Mississippi Flyway are really dry. So you get blue wings on the move, and they can get out of there in a hurry. And so they probably, there was production. I mean, I hunted early teal season and shot I don't know, 10 or 15 blue wings and several hunts. And, for whatever it's worth, the age ratio, that was about a little less than 1-to-1, immatures to adults. So there was some production somewhere. But by and large, right now, I think what we're seeing, at least in my experience, is that's flyover country for ducks because there's just not much there.
Yeah, flyover country in the spring, definitely. And then we're also seeing
Right
flyover
now.
country now.
Yeah,
right?
I think so. Based on my duck hunting experience, you'd find a wetland and maybe a couple of hundred ducks at best. And if you went in and hunted it, you'd get one hunt that was, you might get a half a limit of birds. Next week, actually, they didn't come back to it. So you just blew them right out of there. Normally in that area, you can scout around and find another spot pretty easily. That was not the case this time. And so some of the birds we did shoot, shot some widgeon, probably boreal birds. There were a lot of young ear birds in that mix. But by and large, there just weren't many birds in the country, which tells me, if they're not there, they're either
Where
to
are
the
they?
north in
Yeah.
the boreal still because it was that kind of still warm.
Yeah.
But that won't last,
Yep.
and it may be over already. That country freezes up really quick, and then they're going to go, and they're not going to have tons and tons of options. So it's kind of year where if you find water, you're probably going to have a couple of decent hunts, regardless of where you are, at least in the western half of the states.
So, Scott, I want you to follow up on that a little bit. It has, as I've thought about, I'm not going to make it to Canada this year, but as I've kind of lived vicariously through the stories and experiences of other people, I've tried to put myself up there and say, okay, well, if we found water, I would think that we would find a lot of birds. But did you see that, or was it a sort of surprisingly low number of birds even in those areas where you found water? Kind of describe that interaction of bird abundance and water as you saw it this year.
Yeah, well, yeah, as I think about that, I mean, early for teal, where we found water, we found teal. But I agree with Tom. I think production was not great. My age ratios and my harvest for teal, which wasn't a big sample, but 40 or so birds, was about 2-to-1, twice as many adults as young, which usually it would be the other way around. So not a ton of production out of them. But yeah, so, in Manitoba where we've found pockets of water, and there's probably, a threshold. You need so much water kind of in the area to have other spots that birds can go to, like Tom described. If you shoot them off of one spot, if that's the only spot, for 10 miles, they're probably going to pull out and go somewhere else. If they've got 10 other spots in the area to go to, then they have other options to stick around that area for a little bit. So, where we found water that was not super isolated, there were birds, and there were decent numbers of birds. We had some good hunts. This past weekend, I had a hunt in Manitoba, again an area that had maintained those water conditions in semi-permanent wetlands, and two of us shot limits of mallards with a bonus black duck thrown in. So that was pretty good. But it's not like you could drive almost anywhere across the prairies and find those kind of conditions like you could in a more normal year. That would be pretty commonplace in a normal year. This year, it's like, yeah, there are a few spots where you could find that, but not widespread.
Yeah, it's definitely a year that people will remember. Scott, what do you think about Tom's, I guess, sort of mental idea or hypothesis, you might say, that maybe some of these birds are still up in the boreal? If we had a good flyover of the prairies in the spring, those birds would have gone to the boreal. A disproportionately large number of birds might have gone to the boreal, and maybe they're still hanging out there. You have any insight or any anecdotal evidence or any feel as to if that may still be happening?
Yeah, I think that definitely happens for some birds. We know that things like pintails, when the prairies are dry, they overfly and move further north to Alaska and boreal areas. Things like blue wings, probably not so much. So, that may explain they were ready to head south earlier and, showed up on wintering areas in good numbers. So, it depends on the species that we're talking about. But I think in general, it's definitely been warm. Like even here at my house in southern Manitoba, we've not had a real hard frost yet. which is unusual. So it's been mild, it's been dry, and weather-wise, there's really been nothing to move birds. There are a bunch of birds that move on their own just because of the time of the year, like blue wings, like canvasbacks, like the cranes do. But for mallards and things like that need a little weather to move them, no, there's been nothing to really stir migration yet.
Guys, that's a great sort of summary of what you saw in terms of wetland conditions and maybe a little report there on the birds. But now let's get to the important stuff of your hunting success, your hunting experience.
That won't take long.
Well, Tom, let's go.
Yours was fishing experience, wasn't Tom? You were after those slew snakes.
Yeah, slime rockets.
So, Tom, let's go to you first then. Tell us about your hunting experience up there. What did y'all go? What were y'all targeting? How successful were you? And it sounds like you might have had to call an audible, Omaha, audible.
Yeah, Omaha, Saskatoon. Yeah, we did. So typically we hunt. We drive a lot scouting. In fact, about 1,000 miles over the course of about 2 weeks up there, and that's just the scouting part. We're looking typically for two things. If we can find them, we want to find ducks feeding in fields. That typically would be a mallard pintail hunt. Didn't find that at all, so that was unfortunate, but sometimes that's the way that goes. So we also hunt wetlands sometimes, and most of our focus is on puddle ducks. When you start hunting wetlands, you start to get into other species besides mallards and pintails. They're there, of course, and we shoot them. But widgeons, teal, those sorts of birds all around. Not too many divers in that country. It's not really a diving duck kind of country as much. So we don't focus much on those at all, incidental maybe. And so what we find this year was we didn't find any field feeding birds, found some field feeding geese, but not many, which is uncommon. It's usually easy to find geese, usually easy to find cranes. I attribute that to the lack of water in Luck Lake. That's a huge roost, and there's just not a lot of water in it. There were a handful of cranes around, and we found a couple fields of geese, which is really abnormal. They're usually pretty thick in that country. Then when we went to duck hunting, we pretty much began focusing on water. And honestly, I think there might have been 10 wetlands in all that we found. They were all semi-perms. The first hunt we made was a fairly big, and it's hard to hunt those big wetlands because ducks do what they always do on big water, which is land out in the middle. But we hadn't never hunted it before, right? And so we see about 200 ducks, quite a few mallards, get permission, go in dark early in the morning and set up where we saw them. Well, that turned out to be a real booger because it was one of those dead margin aspen wetlands, and it had oddly enough, a healthy population of beavers.
Oh, boy.
So we had beavers swimming around, staring us down, looking at us, and we couldn't set the decoys because it ended up being too deep.
Yeah.
So Jerry kind of set just a couple right in the edge of the trees.
You didn't visit the wetland the night before because you didn't want to disturb the birds.
We didn't want to bust those birds out of there because that's the recipe for disaster, given how dry it was. So I shot one mallard, and then I decided, okay, well, let me take a walk. And I found on the north end of that wetland, a nice shallow slope was a little bit more open. So we moved and set up there in a more normal manner for duck hunting with decoys and whatnot. And the ducks were just tough, right? They all wanted to not work well, characteristic of adult birds, right?
Yep.
And so we managed, I think, in that hunt, maybe 6 birds. 3 of us, 6 birds. For those of you that don't know, the limit in Canada is 8 a day. So that was I was happy. We saw a few birds. Dogs got some work. We both have puppies or young dogs.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that because I know this would be the first real year that Peck has had an opportunity.
Yeah, last year was a tough year for him, and his first year he blew a knee. So he's a hard luck dog.
You blew a shoulder.
I did blow a shoulder this year. Yeah, that took a little while, but
red shirt season for both of you.
Yeah, well, not anymore. So he got some really great work, despite the fact that there weren't a lot of birds. He got the lights turned on, like a young dog needs, which is really cool. That day I shot a mallard. We shot some widgeon. Big old redhead came cruising by, so I dropped him. It was pretty interesting because he was looked like a dead of winter redhead.
Yeah.
And I was also noticing, and this is observation, I'll be curious to see what Scott thinks about this, but I noticed that the few mallards we were seeing, like scouting and looking them over with binocs, the drakes were pretty far along. Normally up there's a bit of an art to picking drakes. You're looking for just a few green feathers on the head or some bill color, that kind of thing. Would not have been a problem to pick them out had they been around. So that tells me maybe a lot of them just forego breeding and went to molting wetlands, probably up in the boreal, sat around, molted, and really didn't do much for production. Just an observation. And
well,
so,
I'll tell you, I had a conversation or an email exchange with Michael Furtman just a couple of days ago, and he had just returned from North Dakota. He made the exact same observation. The birds were uncharacteristically far along in terms of their plumage development for this time of year. He also found them to be fatter this time of year than normal. So
the birds we did shoot were really fine eating, and we ate them all up there. So we didn't bring any home. That's kind of unusual as well, because usually I try to bring a legal possession limit home. But so it was tough. And the rest of the time we'd scout a wetland, and again, 100 birds, 150. Go in, kill, 3, 4, 6, something like that, and had a couple scratch hunts, which
That's
is tough sledding. I mean,
and unusual
in Saskatchewan. If you scratch, man, you're either doing something real wrong or it's just really tough.
Yeah, or you need a remedial course if you're doing that.
Yeah, well, maybe so. Well, yeah, you didn't invite me, so I don't know. Normally you'd take me out there and lose me. Scott takes me.
I did invite you.
Yeah. Scott took me hunting first time. Got there in the dark at the truck. Next thing I know, he's gone.
He does that.
Over the hill.
But he took you hunting.
He did take me hunting. I didn't know where he went. So I just listened for the
He did his part.
I listened for the shotgun reports and echolocated in on him. Since then, I've called him the Prairie Stalker. So it was tough. Always an enjoyable trip. And we did, in fact, call Saskatoon. The weather was so mild. And if you know anything about fishing in Canada and fishing in fall, fish know winter's coming, man. They were on the feed. And so we were staying in a cabin. Cynthia, who works for DU Canada, Cynthia Callio Edwards, works for DU Canada. She has a cabin. Her family has a cabin on Lake Diefenbaker. So we dropped the boat in and really had some fine northern pike fishing. Slinging spoons over weed beds and caught a lot of fish and had a lot of fun doing that. The dogs don't enjoy that much, but Jerry and I did.
Not much retrieving opportunity.
Not really. I haven't taught them to retrieve pike yet. But, so that was that kind of year, and it's always great to be up there. Great people, lots of fun. Just tough sledding for birds.
Yeah, Scott, what about you? I know after the last report we had with you, where you had been chasing blue-winged teal, I think you headed west a few weeks after that and paired up with Jean-Michel de Vink, DU Canada biologist up there, and I guess you guys went after cranes first, right?
Yeah, we had some guests in for cranes, and so I was east of Saskatoon, and in traditional areas that we've hunted for a number of years for cranes. There were still cranes in that country. Now, what's interesting about cranes is they don't need much water to roost in, kind of enough to. Sometimes I joke and say just enough to cover their toes, but that's pretty accurate. They don't need much water, but they like a little bit to feel safe.
They're also pretty sensitive to those early cold snaps because of that, right?
Yeah, but cranes I would describe as really early migrant birds anyway. We think of them kind of peaking at the tail end of September, early October. So I was there in mid-September and numbers were still building. But yeah, there were decent numbers of cranes around. When we have more water, they're kind of all roosting on a big wetland that holds, 20,000 birds or so. Instead, this year that was dry and they were kind of scattered across the landscape. So it spread them out a bit, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. So we had some good crane hunts.
Okay, so I'm gonna stop you there. You and I have had conversations about cranes before, and I think you told me. Maybe I'm making this up. I know you and I had a conversation about crane calls. So one of the things that we're able to do now with the new technology we have here is, I think we kind of dubbed this in on one of our previous episodes, but we have an opportunity to do it live here. So here's some crane calls for us. It's a beautiful sound.
It is.
Cranes flying overhead. That actually apparently was recorded in Nebraska there. So if you're out this year and you hear that sound, look up, look around. That sound carries for miles, and so they're a fascinating bird. Did I make up the part about you having a crane call?
Well, no.
Apparently not, with that hesitation.
I had a crane call.
Not talking electronic either. Can't do that.
No, you can't do that. I had a crane mouth call. I think one of the guys who was up left that with me. My challenge is to blow the crane call correctly. You need to be able to trill your tongue.
Yeah, that's right. That's what we did.
Yeah, roll your R's, and I am not able to do that yet. That should have been on the list during the pandemic of figure that out, but that did not get done.
So that training that instructional training I provided during that previous podcast was not enough.
No, didn't help me. So I don't know. Mormon, can you do that? Can you roll your R's?
I cannot, and I think that actually might be genetic. So you might be just SOL like I am.
I think you can train yourself.
Yeah, we need to find somebody who can do that to blow a crane call when we're up there, because I think it would be super effective. Like I've seen the YouTube videos where guys are doing that, and man, they sound good, and it carries forever, and the birds will come to it. So
maybe we should take you to an oral surgeon and get you like a Gene Simmons kind of surgery. Then you'd be able to flap your tongue around a little better.
Maybe, yeah, like maybe that would work. If I'm not going to learn it, then some sort of $6 million man work might be the right ticket.
All right, okay, moving on. So you did have success with the cranes. Your crane silhouette decoys came in handy, right?
Yep, they did. Crane silhouettes. I was actually testing some new crane socks that I had too, and those, with the right day with wind, those are pretty effective because they give you a little movement in the decoys and just add to the realism. So those were pretty slick. Had good success on cranes.
Tom, did y'all get in on some cranes? I know you mentioned them. Did y'all?
We saw them, and we had a real hard time patterning the cranes that we did see. The numbers were down around Luck Lake in general, and the wetland that we typically rely on for crane hunting to supply our cranes out to the field kind of deal was dry. Okay. And so down towards the little town of Luck Lake, that lower end of Luck Lake itself had a bit of water, and so most of the crane activity had moved east and south of us. We saw them, we just couldn't figure out the right kind of setup, and they'd be there one day and then they'd be somewhere else the next, almost like chasing snow geese.
So you guys were just trying to pass shoot them, or did you have
we would have set up on them had we been able to get them to cooperate, so to speak, but they just didn't. We also have some places that we can pass shoot, but that lake was dry, so that eliminated that opportunity.
Yeah. So Scott, what did y'all do after the cranes? You go after geese? Do you hunt geese at all?
Yeah, so I trekked further west of Saskatoon, and met a few other DU friends, and we chased white fronts. And there were ducks out there too, so we shot a few ducks. And white fronts was interesting. Didn't know quite what to expect. Weren't sure what conditions were going to be like. There was still plenty of water to stage white fronts. We found birds, got permission, ended up hunting 3 days within about 1.5 miles of where we had started. All the fields were right there in close proximity, and we had good success on white fronts. It was a little bit tough though. Like many times, white fronts are pretty friendly to the decoys and pretty easy to deal with, and these were tougher. And out of our 3-day tally, I think we killed 43 white fronts, and we had 3 juvenile birds.
Oh, wow.
So at least from that sample, that would lead me to believe that conditions wherever those birds were breeding across the Arctic was not great, may have been late, and production not great on those. But again, a fairly small sample. I did shoot a banded white front.
Oh, nice. Where was it banded?
Yeah, it was banded as an adult in 2004.
Oh, wow.
On the North Slope of Alaska. So that's at least a 17-year-old bird.
Wow.
So just thinking about, how much country that bird saw during its life and how many migrations it's made is pretty cool.
Was that a goose or a gander?
That was a male.
Okay. All right. Well, that's better a male then I get, well, I don't know. They pair for life. So
Not anymore.
That's right. That's right. She'll go off and find, if she's as old as that guy, then she'll go off and find her another good male.
Right.
What else then do we need to cover there on your hunting success?
Well, maybe I'll say where we did get into ducks out there, like we were hunting white fronts and there were big waves of mallards and pintails working the field there. My friends were probably a little bit grumpy because we were close to the white front limit and I wanted to get the white front limit before we started in on the ducks. So ducks were flying and active a bit before we started in on them. And I think that day we each shot half a limit in the morning and then we came back out in the afternoon in the same spot and shot a few more birds. But if we had been focused on ducks, we could have shot a limit of ducks.
Yeah, they probably reminded you of that throughout the rest of the day, the rest of the week, right? That y'all had to pass up your ducks that morning.
Yeah, well, there was plenty of debate in the blind that day. It's like, let's shoot these ducks. It's like, no, there are geese coming. So, yeah. You'll have to check in with Dr. Adair next time you have him in because he was the one wanting to shoot ducks.
Oh, okay. Well, we got a question about that here just a second. I will say that I saw some report yesterday about Arctic goose production. I think there's mixed reports from different parts of the production areas. I've been trying to connect with Ray Alisauskas to kind of get him on to give us the annual update on sort of what we can glean from the available climatological information about the likely hatch, likely productivity of the different goose colonies. I think Wrangell Island was certainly another bright spot from everything I've heard, but I think once you get into the central Arctic and eastern Arctic, maybe it's a bit of a mixed bag. So let's move on here. I got a question for you, Scott. I know you are never shy about developing new types of decoys, whether it be your silhouettes or where
two-dimensional ducks.
Two-dimensional ducks, skinny ducks for skinny times. I kind of wonder, have you been experimenting with any other types of decoys this year?
Not any new varieties, I guess. I did like
now. Let's not restrict it to waterfowl decoys either. What was it called?
I actually know what it's called, so I'll remind Scott about the song dogs.
The song dogs.
Oh, okay, yeah.
So tell us about that.
So we should talk about this because what I find is most of us have been hunting long enough. Like a really new and novel idea in duck hunting is kind of hard to come by, you see variations and stuff and it's like, oh yeah, we've done something like that before, but this was a totally new one for me. So, and I'll credit our new CEO who's just started for Ducks Unlimited Canada, Larry Comeyer. He had joined on one of the crane hunts that we had guests in for, and we were driving around and scouting and talking, and he said, have you used the Coyote Decoy? And I was like, for shooting coyotes? And he was like, no, when you're goose hunting or whatever. And it's like, no, tell me more about that. And so his story was, if you have a big field that birds are using and you want to set up in one part of the field, you can put out either, a full body coyote decoy, or I was able to find a skinny coyote decoy, a two-dimensional one, to put out that the geese will see that and kind of not land in that part of the field, but he described it as you can kind of squeeze them over into the part of the field that you want them to be in, where your decoys are set up. So yeah, I had this decoy along when we were hunting white fronts, and my partners were a little skeptical of that.
But, you don't say. I would have never thought that.
Yeah, but got a big kick out of having the song dog. There was lots of discussion. That's what the decoy was called. On the box it said song dog. So we were always talking about should we break out the song dog, and then there was discussion about might we get rifle bullets rained our way if we had the song dog out and had the wrong angle between the road and our blind and some of those things. But I'll admit that's a new one for me. Like I had not heard that concept of putting out a coyote decoy that would kind of cause birds to shy away from one part of the field, or maybe you could even put it in an adjacent field and have birds, shy away from that and come to where you had decoys. So I thought that was pretty cool. So I'll test it out. I don't have enough trials yet to see whether it's effective or not. But
so here's a stimulated a similar idea for me that you should try as well. Is maybe get yourself 4 or 5 mannequins, stick them out there about 400 yards all around you, and that'll focus those birds right into you, man. I could see you going down the road. Dress them in blaze orange, by the way.
Yeah, you're thinking put them at like 45 yards around the decoy spread?
No. I'm talking about putting about 400 yards out. So the geese are coming and they say, man, there's a dude over there. Let's go over here.
Yeah, we could try that, and I guess you think about all the time and energy that humans have put into things like scarecrows to get birds to deter birds. This is an old challenge. So maybe it's not all that novel, but that was a new one for me in thinking about waterfowl hunting.
It does add a different level of complexity, another variable to the equation whenever the ducks and geese just aren't finishing right. Not only now do you have to consider whether you need to move or reconfigure your duck decoys, you also need to decide whether you need to reconfigure, reposition your coyote decoy or your mannequins, right?
That's right.
That may be a little much.
You can move the mannequin over about 20 yards. I think this baby's going to work.
Yeah, well, it definitely made for good conversation.
There's no doubt about that.
We did put it out one day, and I will say the day that we put it out is the day that we shot a limit of white fronts, we shot some ducks, and I shot the banded birds.
Well, there you go.
Now, have you seen, talked to your CEO since then? Did he say, you really fell for that?
he did not say that.
Okay.
But when we talked about it, he said he's got like 3 of them, 3 coyote decoys that he will deploy to squeeze the birds where he wants them to be. So I think he's figured it out and used it effectively. I'm still green on the deployment of the song dog decoy, but I'm working on it.
That would have been my fears, that he would have been just pulling my leg. You weren't concerned about that? You're willing to try anything.
Maybe that says something about either my gullibility or my willingness to try new things. But no, I was like, hey, that's worth a shot. What do you got to lose?
All right. Okay, so let's move on here, start to wrap this up. Tom, what's next? What do you have, I guess, here over the next few months? What are your hunting plans? I'm sure you're eyeing it up. Any more trips or anything of that nature? And I guess also just kind of from a personal perspective, since you've been retired, what you've been up to and kind of what's on the future here.
Yeah, no trips are planned at the moment. We've contemplated a couple, maybe out to the Midwest or down to the Gulf Coast later this winter, but we'll see. Working on renewing a duck lease. We'll see if we do or don't. If we do, then I have some management work to do out there, get the tractor over there and do some work. Getting a little late for that, so that needs to get done. Obviously working on some deer hunting land, so got to, in fact, head over there tomorrow and get some work done on that. Retirement's been really fun. I do have to say the first 6 months or so was downtime with the shoulder. So try not to tear your rotator cuff. It's not very pleasant,
especially when you have a young pup.
Yeah. Young pup needs to go, and
I wondered why you weren't pitching anywhere this postseason, but now it makes sense.
Well, the scouts had me almost signed up for the Cincinnati Reds, and the downside of that is my mom's the biggest Cincinnati Reds fan, and I'd hated to have her yelling at the TV screen telling me how bad I was. So no, my contract went away for the Reds, but that's okay. I'm just doing a little work here and there with DU on a contract, and then puttering around on land. We're planning a few, Anne-Marie and I are planning some road trips, one of which will be to Prairie, Canada. She hadn't been up there in a long time, probably a spring trip. I'm kind of interested to see it when the water comes back.
Yeah, for sure.
Now, having seen it so dry, I want to see that explosion of life that happens when the water comes. So I'll be keeping an eye on wetland conditions up there, try and time it with that. That'll be a really fun trip. So, yeah, things like that. And all good. And it's really great to be back here at Memphis, see a lot of my friends. I miss them.
Scott, what about you? Well, I'm sure you have a few more hunting trips planned. Is Delta Marsh on one of those? Is that in the future? I have found myself wondering what conditions are like over there, kind of given the drought. Any insight on that?
Yeah, so I have a few reports from Delta Marsh. The water's super low. In fact, many areas that I had spent time on are completely dry and growing up in germinating cattails and some of those things. So the water is very low. There are a few birds still out there. I was out for a meeting last night with some folks at Delta Marsh, but yeah, conditions are tough. There isn't a ton of food there because of the low water conditions. There wasn't great submerged aquatic vegetation that grew. So that's tough. So I'm not sure I will venture out there again given conditions. But yeah, I hope there are still a few either goose hunts or especially mallard hunts somewhere around here in Manitoba. And then I did get an invite to come down this winter to down in you guys' neck of the woods by our friend Dr. Curtis Hopkins. So I would like to do that
you should.
in December or something, or January, but we'll see if I'm able to put that together.
Yeah, for sure. It'd be good. Make sure you swing by here. We'll actually have you in studio for the first time ever.
All right. Maybe I can find my jacket somewhere
We'll look around.
We
might be
in
able
the
to
closet that keeps getting lost in the mail.
Yeah, keep me posted on that deal. If you come, I'll cook dinner for you or something. You might have to supply the meat because I hadn't killed a lot, but
coots. He'll pull some coots out of the freezer.
I'll get some coots and gallon noodles out.
Yeah, maybe we can go in there, Mormon, and we can rummage around and find the closet with all the swag in it.
Yeah, maybe.
Get us some.
Who knows? They might have mannequins here you can take back for your hunting operation.
Make sure you bring a trailer.
I don't have any of those yet.
Well, guys, this has been fun. It's been great from a number of levels to get both of you here on the podcast. Tom, great having you back here at headquarters in studio with us. Thanks for joining us. And Scott, as always, thanks to you for spending your time with us. And I know you have a few other things to get to today, so we'll let you go. Thanks for joining us, both of you.
Thanks, Mike.
Yep, happy to be here.
A special thanks to our guest on today's episode, Dr. Tom Mormon and Dr. Scott Stevens. We greatly appreciate their expertise and their firsthand insights from the prairies this year. As always, we thank our producer, Chris Isaac, and Clay Baird for the great work that they collectively do getting these podcasts out to you. And to you, the listener, we thank you for your time and we thank you for your support of wetlands and waterfowl conservation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the DU Podcast. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show. And visit www.ducks.org/DU Podcast for resources based on today's topics, as well as access to more episodes. Opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect those of Ducks Unlimited. Until next time, stay tuned to the Ducks.